experience. I wound up on the federal government's Kyoto Implementation Process, or what they lightheartedly called the Kyoto Implementation Process, and I got to see a sort of a degree of I got to see how really good climate policy is blocked. So I wound up fairly politicized from that experience, and then I was working for this guy named James Hogan, who doing some contract work for a guy named James Hogan, who's a public relations guy, who really quite an interesting guy on the West Coast. He was coincidentally on the David Suzuki Foundation board at the time, and is now the chair. He wound up with a similar kind of unlikely interest in climate change, because he thought in the early part of this decade that he would like to do a public service thing on his website. And someone said, why don't you do climate change? Because it's controversial, it's interesting, and everybody would benefit if you could just go in there and do a presentation that was impartial and forthright, and you could sort it out for everyone. So he said, sure. That sounded like a great idea. And he started reading a lot of stuff about climate science. And he started reading good sources. He tried to find good sources. He went to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and to the American Academy of Sciences, and to the Royal Society of Canada and the Royal Society. And what he found was a surprising lack of controversy. He knew that there was this terribly controversial subject, but in the science literature there seemed to be no controversy. And so that seemed suspicious, and he went then back to the public conversation and started to look at what was happening there. And what he saw there was not science, but public relations, and lots of it. And it drove him crazy. And I was already crazy, and we were working together, and a friend of his had come into a bunch of money, and Jim had given him a copy of one of Ross Gelbspan's great books. Ross Gelbspan is a guy from Boston who wrote Boiling Point and The Heat Is On, two terrific books on climate change. And he did some of the really good original work on how this whole topic has got out of hand. And Jim gave his friend John Lefebvre one of these books, and John got crazy and gave us the money to start the DeSmogBlog. Which is basically a research project and a website that we have been running for 5 years. So that was all a big preamble to what I want to talk about today, which is the disinformation campaign about climate science. And I want to basically make 3 points today. First of all, that our current the public's current really dramatic misunderstanding of climate science is not accidental. It results from a very purposeful, extremely professional, very well executed 20-year campaign to confuse us. The second point is that the people involved, and particularly the people involved who have been presented to us as scientific experts, are not. That there are some extraordinarily dubious characters in the mix, and although there are friends in noisy places. Although there are people in the conversation who are sincere, the underlying group, the people who have really set fire to the conversation are I think dubious is a reasonable word. The third point is that the impact has been severe. The impact has been dramatic, and that brings us to Copenhagen and to some of what's been happening and some of what I think is going to continue to happen in the next little while for sure. So I want to start with a pop quiz because we're in school, shouldn't we? To be taken seriously, not personally. If you don't get the answers right away, just a couple of questions. And if you don't get the answers right away, that's okay. The first question, who said the scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases such as CO2 on climate is well understood, well established, and cannot be denied? So, do you think, and if you know the answer, don't shout it out until I've got all the answers down. Was it Dr. Regina, the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Dr. James Hansen, one of the smartest climate scientists on the continent for sure. Dr. David Suzuki, the environmentalist. Or Leonard S. Bernstein, the senior scientist in 1995 of Mobil Corporation. Got people giggling, that's good. It was, of course, Leonard S. Bernstein. In 1995, an organization called the Global Climate Coalition, which was a coalition of oil companies, manufacturers, auto manufacturers, aluminum companies, the odd nuclear company, a big consortium of people who had an interest whose interests could be negatively affected by a public consciousness of climate change, had started the Global Climate Coalition and were using it to sow the seeds of doubt in the general public. And in 95, they said, okay, we should probably get a serious report on this. So they asked the senior scientist at Mobil, later ExxonMobil, to do a report. And he came back and said, well, that it cannot be denied. 1995. So, who said, those who think we are powerless to do anything about the greenhouse effect, forget about the White House effect. As president, I intend to do something about it. Was that Bill Clinton in 1992? Al Gore in 2000? Barack Obama in 2007? Or George Bush the Elder campaigning against Michael Dukakis in 1988? There's a hope for that same laugh again. It is, of course, the smarter George Bush. So, in 1988, the Republican Party, the leader of the Republican Party candidate for president, the guy who won the election, knew that climate change was a problem and had promised to do something about it. In 88, in 95, ExxonMobil was saying this is something that can't be denied, and today we're in a wash of confusion. So the question, of course, is why, and the answer is, as I say, 20 years of very intentional campaigning to have us think that this is a confusing thing. The Western Fuels Association is an organization, a cooperative of companies that are in coal-fired electricity. Coal-fired electricity is the largest point source of CO2 in the United States, and the electricity company owners are in this vast cooperative called the Western Fuels Association. And they, in 1991, developed an organization which they called ICE, and they set about a campaign to convince people either that climate change was not happening at all or that it was a good thing. And if you really are interested in this, there's a YouTube video or a video that's available on YouTube called "The Greening of Mother Earth," and it's hilarious. It's stunningly serious and hilariously funny at the same time. There's a wonderful animation about midway through when they show the beneficial effects of extra CO2 in the atmosphere helping plants to grow, and they do this animation of plants growing across the whole world, storming across the Sahara, as if water was not a problem in the whole idea of growing things. Anyway, in addition to doing that video, they created quite an extensive quite an extensive strategy to convince people, and particularly they picked particularly on people in towns where the community was served by a coal-fired electric facility among those that they owned, and they did a bunch of they hired a DC public relations firm to focus group a whole bunch of messages, and then they trotted those messages out in radio and television advertising and in newspaper advertising in those towns. And the kinds of messages they came up with were, some say the earth is warming, some also said the earth was flat. Who told you the earth was warming? Chicken Little? This, if you read the denier-sphere stuff, that's a line that still comes up a lot. How much are you willing to pay for a problem that may not exist? This undercurrent of doubt. And my favorite, if the earth is getting warmer, why is Minneapolis getting colder? Well, in 1991, Minneapolis was not getting colder. It was getting warmer. It was steadily. But what you had to understand about these messages is that they were not being tested for accuracy. They were being tested for effectiveness. They were being tested for how compelling they were in convincing people that whatever they seemed to be thinking was happening around them was a ruse, that just because it seemed to be getting warmer every year, it wasn't really. So the Western Fuels Association, and they did a bunch of other things. They hired a bunch of scientists whose names would become well known, guys like Pat Michaels, to act as spokesters, to write op-ed pieces or to at least sign opinion page pieces, which then they would then trot around to any newspaper that had the temerity to write a story about climate change that suggested that it was a problem. Right away, they'd get some PR guy on the phone saying, you had that scientist in the paper yesterday? Well, we have a scientist who says that it's completely different, and, well, he's written an opinion page piece, and you're honor-bound out of a sense of fairness to let us have a chance to put that in the paper, and so away you go. I'll jump to the next one. Doubt is our product. Doubt is our product. Since the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public, it is also the means of establishing a controversy. This, of course, was from big tobacco in the 60s. And people talk about, whenever I start talking about this whole issue and about the idea of a public relations campaign to disabuse the public of factual information, they always say, well, that sounds like tobacco. It doesn't just sound like tobacco. In this context, it is tobacco. In 1992, a PR company called APCO Worldwide, which is a huge PR company, working for Philip Morris, said to Philip Morris, you guys have no credibility whatsoever. There isn't a person in the world that will still believe a tobacco company employee or a tobacco-employed scientist who says that tobacco's not bad for you. So we need to find another. I'm sure they didn't say we need to find another scam, but they said we need to find another way to make this message palatable in the public. So what they said was, perhaps if we start a grassroots organization, an arm's length, and I use these, you have to not take any of these phrases seriously, an arm's length grassroots organization of independent scientists who will say that smoking is not a problem, perhaps then the people will be suckered, will be convinced. So they invented the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition. But they also said, if we start this thing and tobacco companies are the only people who are behind it, we're not going to be very credible. So we're going to have to recruit some other people to be part of it. And they came up with their early objectives, and you can get all this stuff because of the tobacco lawsuits that were pursued by many of the states in the United States during the 1990s. All of this stuff is now available online, or a great part of it. If you Google tobacco documents, there's wonderful stuff. So, yeah, you can read this yourself. The objectives of the media plan are to establish task as a credible source for reporters when questioning the validity of scientific studies. Encourage the public to question from the grassroots up. Does everybody know about astroturfing? An astroturf group being a fake grassroots organization. Question from the grassroots up the validity of scientific studies. And this third one I like, to mobilize support for task through alliances with other organizations and third-party allies. Well, you notice here that nowhere do they talk about questioning the science through science. I mean, they wouldn't actually sponsor research or anything. It's all public relations. And in terms of looking for third-party allies, they actually sent 20,000 letters to other businesses of all sorts that they thought might be likely sources, likely culprits, can I say, to jump into bed with them on this campaign. Oh, I just went through those. On this campaign for sound science. And the kinds of people they went looking for were companies that were going to be affected by global warming, issues around nuclear waste disposal, diseases, pests in agriculture, biotechnology, genetically modified organisms, the whole. And they got lots of good support. So again, you had a very specific, very well-defined, very well-financed campaign. The first executive director was a senator from the Southwest. I can't remember his name, but the second one was a guy named Steve Malloy, who was a one-time APCO PR guy, who started a website called Junk Science, which thrives today. Steve Malloy today can be seen on Fox News as a junk science expert, and boy, he is an expert in junk science. But they get completely wrong what that really means. So they set up this organization. They again employed all these scientists, people like Pat Michaels and Fred Seitz and Fred Singer, names that if you read the DeSmogBlog or you look at our database, you get to recognize these people pretty quickly. Or if you just read through the stuff and see any time someone says, I have a scientific expert, it doesn't take very long before you know who all the experts are. So in 1997, the American Petroleum Institute, first of all, these guys kept getting caught. The Western Fuels Initiative Association, they got caught or found out that they were doing this. The Task completely blew up in the midst of the tobacco lawsuits. So 1997, the American Petroleum said, we need a new strategy, and they hired a whole bunch of people, including Steve Malloy as strategists, and they came up with a whole new document on how to confuse people about climate change, and a whole series of even more refined tactics and techniques. One of the ones that was creepy but successful was that they said, rather than picking on major markets where you have bigger newspapers, bigger television stations, a danger of people with actual expertise, beat reporters who take an interest in science, let's go to the minor markets where you have young reporters passing through on their way to a career somewhere else, who are probably general assignment, probably not subject area experts, and probably much more likely to accept a reasonable sounding, not just a reasonable sounding expert, but a really talented expert. Because one of the other things they did was media train all their scientists. They found guys who would do the work, who would say the things that they wanted them to say, and then they gave them media training. Again, they got them to sign op-ed pieces. They got them to help prepare documents that went to politicians, and again to the public and to small and medium-sized newspapers and television stations in a very aggressive way. So again, if ever there was a story that appeared saying this is an issue, climate change is an issue, you could be guaranteed that someone would phone you and say, no, it isn't. They got letter-writing campaigns going. Well, to the degree, this was all of their strategy. And they again got found out not long afterwards, and they said, oh yeah, so we're not going to do any of this. But all of the people who they talked about in their document all wound up signing opinion page pieces and turning up everywhere in television interviews. And they had said when they were setting it up, they said, victory will be achieved when average citizens understand the uncertainties in climate science. Uncertainties become part of the conventional wisdom. Victory will be achieved when the media understands uncertainties in climate science. And victory will be achieved when the media coverage recognizes balance on climate science and the recognition of the validity of viewpoints that challenge the current conventional wisdom. So again, to that first point, the whole idea that there should be a debate in the public was not accidental. It's completely intentional. And people will argue about whether, God knows they'll argue, and they'll write letters and get all nasty because I'm suggesting that people have done something that's fundamentally sleazy. But there it is, 3 major organizations with tons of money that had set out strategies that have then suddenly been, or not suddenly, but consistently been executed, whether by their hands or not. Among the strategies, I should just let everybody read this for a second. the strategies that, among the really excellent strategies that have been used in this campaign all along, the whole idea of language and the manipulation of language and the encouragement of people to misunderstand one way or the other has been done sometimes really well. There's a guy named George Lakoff in the States who talks about framing, has done excellent work on framing. And he talks about how you set the agenda of a conversation by establishing a certain perspective, and how once you establish that perspective, that frame, it's very difficult for anybody else to push the public off it. And one of the really elegant examples that he presented was the idea of tax relief. Just the words tax relief. You have a complete story. Because even if you don't already think that taxes are toxic, the word relief implies that you have an ailment. You have something from which you need to be relieved. So when one politician stands up and talks about the necessity for tax relief and his willingness to provide tax relief, and the other politician stands up and snarls, "We don't need tax relief. Rich people don't need tax relief," he's just reinforced the frame twice. And he's made himself sound like an insensitive person because here are these people who need relief and he's not going to provide it. So you wind up having, ideally, there is no ideal at this point because the frame has been set and it's very difficult to change the frame. But in 2002, this guy, Frank Luntz, who's a pollster for the Republican Party, said, the Republicans, and this was going into the midterm elections in the not smarter George Bush's first term. He said, okay, the Republican Party's weakest link at this point was the environment, and they needed to learn how to communicate about the environment better. A policy guy would have perhaps suggested that they needed to do better things on the environment, but that's not Frank's job. So Frank, talking about climate change, came up with this. So, in 1988, George Bush was going to have the White House effect, and in 1995 it was indisputable. But in 2002, voters believe there is still no consensus. So let's just hammer that message home, folks, because as long as we can, we're not going to have to do anything about it. Now, Frank Luntz, interestingly, has found religion on this issue. In the last 3 or 4 years, and just in the last 3 or 4 months, he's done a new paper on how to position climate change, how to position climate change so that you can get to good policies. And one of his recommendations is that you don't talk about climate change at all. He said, talk about energy security, talk about clean green jobs, talk about the improvements in health that you'll have from burning fewer fossil fuels, but don't say the climate change word because it's fully framed and it's just a hassle. Interesting, probably in some ways good advice. This is from an Andrew Coyne. I have actually a really long presentation. If we were here for 2 hours, I'd give you a much longer presentation because I sort of couldn't help but deconstruct this Andrew Coyne piece that appeared in Maclean's a couple of weeks ago, because he said just a whole series of the most outrageous things. But just for purposes of where I want to go right now, self-professed defenders of science should not fall into the trap of regarding every dissent from orthodoxy in the same light. Again, a lovely use of language. He's really a good writer. There are 2 traps, actually, being too closed-minded and too open. We are not obliged to give 9/11 truthers and other cranks a respectful hearing. Indeed, we are obliged not to. We dishonor our worthy opponents if we treat our unworthy opponents with the same deference. But we do far worse when we dismiss eminent scientists who happen to fall outside the scientific consensus as lunatics or hired guns. Among the eminent scientists he then referred to was a guy named Freeman Dyson, who he talked about the nuanced objections of Freeman Dyson. Well, for those of you who don't know, Freeman Dyson was one of the world's great physicists. In 1949, he contributed to a breakthrough in physics for which many people complained that he was robbed of a Nobel Prize. Brilliant guy. Today, he's an 87-year-old crank. not to put too fine a point on it, he's a curmudgeonly old contrarian who just argues about everything. His wife says that he's crazy on climate change, and his wife is a fairly senior academic herself. He was quoted he's frequently quoted these days. He was the subject of a 7,000-word profile in the New York Times Magazine, in which they presented him as a nuanced skeptic, as somebody who actually knew something about climate science. He was one of the greatest physicists in the world during his heyday. He hasn't committed any science at all in 50 years. He never did climate change. He never did atmospheric physics. He was never an expert of any, in any field that was relevant. And yet, because he's Freeman Dyson, we should listen to him in his dotage on an issue that is imminently critical to the human race. So you don't want to call him a lunatic because he doesn't deserve it. You want to treat a guy like that with respect. But he's promoting lunacy. And it becomes difficult. The other kinds of people who we have to deal with are guys like Dr. S. Fred Singer, who's been an expert on everything. This is one of the denier sphere's favorite people. Fred Singer will deny almost anything you like as long as there's money attached to it. He denied that secondhand smoke is bad for you. He denied that chlorofluorocarbons were implicated in the ozone hole. He denies that asbestos is bad for you. He denies all the time that climate change is either happening or a problem. He's been intimately associated, and here you get a guy who's, if not a lunatic, certainly a hired gun, because he's been implicated directly in taking money from fossil fuel companies. We accused him of lying on the DeSmogBlog, and we got a nasty letter from his lawyer saying you can't call me a liar. And liar is a bad word in journalism, because in order to prove someone's a liar, in order to say someone's a liar, you can't just say that what they said was incorrect. You have to say that it was incorrect. They knew that it was incorrect at the time that they said it, and they said it with malice aforethought. So Fred Singer said that he'd never taken money from big oil, but he said it in print in the Washington Post. But he said it at a time when ExxonMobil was boasting on their website that he'd been a recipient of a grant from the previous year. So when we showed our lawyer the material that we had, the evidence that we had that Fred was in fact lying, our lawyer said, "Wow, this is really good. Like, you can say whatever you like about this guy." So I wrote another DeSmogBlog post, and I put a headline on it: "Liar, liar, Dr. S. Fred Singer's pants are smoking." And I shouldn't be doing this on tape. And the lawyer said, I told you could say whatever you like, but if you get into libel courts, you get before a judge. Judges like to think that you're taking all this stuff seriously, and this might not give them that impression. Can we put a different headline on it? So we did, and now I've blown it anyway. The local talent. There's a guy named Tim Ball, who was for really a short time a professor at the University of Winnipeg. He's sort of the Western Canadian denier for hire. And he actually, this is a guy who's had a very difficult time trying to describe his own career, because he has, for example, suggested that he was a professor, a full professor at the University of Winnipeg, a climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg for 28 years. Given that he resigned in 1996, in order for him to have been a professor for 28 years, they would have had to hire him before he started his BA. And he also said that he was the first climatology professor in Canada, which really does great disservice to all the people who preceded him, who really were climatology professors. He was a geography professor. He did his PhD on the strength of some historical records on Hudson, of historical temperature records from Hudson Bay Company archives. His lifetime peer review production was 4 pieces, 3 of which were directly related to those temperatures. He's never again done atmospheric physics, never done meteorology, doesn't has no specific expertise. And we have a 3-part test at the DeSmogBlog. We ask if someone says if someone denies climate science in any way, we say, okay, 3 questions: are they an expert? Are they currently doing research? Are they publishing in peer-reviewed journals? And are they taking money from big oil or from the fossil fuel industry or any related industry? And in 5 years of research on the DeSmogBlog, we basically cannot find anybody who will pass that test. And I'll apologize in front of Tim Ball if you can find somebody for me, because they're just not there. So question 1 was this: is this a specific campaign? Have we witnessed a specific campaign to deny climate change? Well, certainly it was conceived, and I think objectively we can say that it's been executed. Are we dealing with reputable people in the climate change argument? There are some sincere people. And tell you what, if you read the Wall Street Journal, here, let's go to that. Oh, this is just unkind. Dr. Fred Seitz was, don't look at this for a minute. I'm talking about lunatics and hired guns. Dr. Fred Seitz was the president of the American Academy of Sciences in the 1960s. He was later the president of Rockefeller University. Very senior guy, very smart guy, well respected. Through the rest of the 70s and into the 80s, he was R.J. Reynolds' senior scientist. And he distributed $44 million in research money to scientists who were never quite able to establish a link between smoking and cancer. And here in this is 1989. This is as you can see, a Philip Morris Company memo. They're looking for somebody to talk about science, and they've used Dr. Seitz, but he's quite elderly and not sufficiently rational to offer advice. 1989. So in 1997, there was the launch of something called the Oregon Petition, and this was a petition to scientists in the United States who wanted to add their voice to the weight of opinion that said that this climate change thing is not happening. So they prepared on the letterhead of the National Academy of Science a solicitation letter from Fred Seitz. They prepared a piece written by another completely cranky guy from the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine, which is a barn in Oregon. A paper made up to look like it was from the Journal of the American Academy of Sciences. And they sent out this letter of solicitation to thousands of scientists, or anybody who'd ever actually had a BSc in the United States. So in 1989, this guy is not sufficiently rational for tobacco. And in 1997, he's a leading light in the climate change denial movement. He went on in this until 2007 or 2008 before he finally died. And nobody had actually seen him in the flesh for years. But he was constantly being referred to as a respected and senior scientist who was on our side. So again, it becomes very awkward because you don't want to. I have a father-in-law who has Alzheimer's, and they don't deserve to be roughed up. But I'm sorry. I'm not sorry with Fred Seitz. It's terrible. So what's been the result, or what are some of the complications here? Again, where are we with the science? Between 1993 and 2003, a woman named Naomi Oreskes, she's a science historian from the University of California at San Diego. She's got a book coming out in the spring. I don't know what the title is yet, but I know it's going to be fabulous. And if you want to read hateful things about Fred Singer, apparently she has new research, and it's really good. So she's a fabulous. And in fact, if you just want to have 45 minutes of fabulous entertainment, Naomi Oreskes is a really, really good lecturer. And there are a couple of YouTube videos or a couple of videos that are available online. So if you just do Naomi Oreskes, Google Naomi Oreskes video climate change, it's great stuff. Anyway, Naomi Oreskes in 2004 did a survey of the scientific literature. She looked at all of at an overview of 928 articles. I've given away the answer here. Anyway, she 928 articles that all of the articles that she could find in the ISI database, the ISI Web of Science, and she looked at at them all, looking for anything that specifically took issue with climate change. Now, not saying that 928 were all saying climate change is happening and you have to pay attention. Most of them were saying, this very narrow part of the climate change science is confirmed. But of all of those papers, 0 over that period took specific issue with it. A guy named Benny Pizer, an anthropologist from the UK, tried to argue this point and went wrestling through all of science and tried to come up with a single paper that in fact took issue with climate science. And he wrote a letter to Science Magazine and the journal Science and said, I found some, and they said your methodology sucks, we're not going to print your letter. He then distributed that letter through the internet. It was repeated 1 million times. It was read into the record of the U.S. Senate by Jimmy Inhofe, the senator from Oklahoma, and then chair of the Science and Public Works Committee. A bunch of guys, scientists, chased them around for a couple of years. For 18 months it took them, and said, okay, if you say there are papers out there saying that climate change isn't happening, show us. 18 months later, he comes back with one paper. It was from the Journal of the American Petroleum Geologists, and it wasn't peer-reviewed. So basically, it's not happening. During a similar period, a couple of brothers, academics named Boykoff and Boykoff, Jules and Max, they looked at, not in the full popular, this is a bit of an overstatement, not in the popular press, but in what they called the prestige press, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. And they looked at it all and they said, okay, how much of the time when climate change is being reported, is it being reported flatly, and how much of the time is it being reported with one expert on one hand and one expert on the other? And they found that in 53% of the cases, it was being reported as a could be, could not be kind of scenario. In a further 6% of the cases, it was being reported as just wasn't happening at all, don't worry about it. So in virtually, it's almost 60%, 6 out of 10 newspaper stories in good newspapers. And we're not talking Fox News here or Rush Limbaugh. We're talking the Wall Street Journal, but the New York Times as well. In 60% of the cases in this period of time, they were presenting it as something that may not be happening. So irrespective that George Bush got it in 1988, that Exxon knew it, couldn't deny it in 1995. Last year, when the American public was asked last year whether they believed in climate change, and they'd been asked the same question 18 months earlier. 18 months earlier, they said 71% of them said yes. Last year, 57% said yes. So the number of people, the number of Americans who and the number who believe that humans were responsible is in like 39%. I can't remember. The Pew Center for Research did the research before it came out in October. So that we have this horrifying trajectory. And I'm going to run kind of out of time here if we're going to want to do questions. But this horrifying trajectory that actually came to the cataclysmic, I think, position with the it's all smoke. I wanted to say it's all smoke. With the theft of the emails from East Anglia University last fall. I'm not actually sure when the emails were stolen, but you'll be reading while I'm talking. I break all these PowerPoint rules all the time. You're not supposed to talk while there's something here to read. And this is just confusing, actually. But all these, I don't know if you've heard about the email hacks or the email leaks from East Anglia University, the climatic research unit at East Anglia. It's one of the foremost climate research institutions in the world. And somehow these emails leaked. It was like somebody spilled their coffee and all the emails fell out. Or else, and again, we're talking here about the way people use language and the very manipulative way people use language. They most often, if you again read the denier sphere, they talk about them as leaked emails or hacked emails. And hacked to me implies some enterprising 18-year-old who's playing in his mother's basement and just happens to break through the security of one of the best research universities in the world, and finds 13 years of emails, thousands of emails. Now, he must be an enterprising 18-year-old because he then scoured them for any language that looked at in any way suspicious. And he came up with stuff like this. And really, if you look at most of the quotes from those emails, you'll find that they're full of ellipses and they're all snatches of conversation. This is pretty much the only full quote in the whole thing. And it features Mike's nature trick. A trick obviously being a deception. It's certainly pitched as a deception. When in fact it's not a deception at all. It was something that Mike Mann, who's from the University of Pennsylvania, did to make a climate reconstruction look more appear more accurate, because he put real temperatures in to hide a decline, to hide something that was confusing and objectively wrong, because he had real temperatures instead, in the way tree rings were showing temperature in the mid 60s and early 70s. So you got these things where there were these little questions that you could provoke by combing through 13 years of emails. God, if somebody had 13 years of my emails, I would have to kill myself. And if I had 13 years of emails from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, they would all go to jail, I'm sure. Like, it's just the idea that these guys combed through 13 years of emails from all of these scientists, and this was all they got, I think is one of the most reassuring things I've heard about science in ages. Irrespective of that, Phil Jones, this guy, actually said in one of the emails that he would trash data rather than give it to the bad guys. You're just not. I mean, it's just a bad idea. It's illegal to refuse to answer freedom of information requests when you work for the government, and Phil Jones does. And it's just wrong in a society where science must be transparent to do that. So there were some things in these emails that were damaging and wrong. And you get this climate gate, the final nail in the coffin of anthropogenic global warming. Climate gate caught green-handed. These people just drive me crazy. Climate gate and the elitist roots of global warming alarmism. Roy Spencer is subject to a whole story all of his own. We won't go there. So we had that just before Copenhagen, and Copenhagen was crashing and burning anyway. Countries, and partly because this narrative has gone so badly off the rails, and partly because of 8 years of the George Bush government, and partly because of just many of the things that are happening around the world. Copenhagen was not the chances of a fair, ambitious, and binding agreement at Copenhagen were already pretty slim. But when all this stuff struck in the 2 weeks before Copenhagen, it's just serendipitously, just complete coincidence that 2 weeks before the most important climate conference in 10 years, all of a sudden these hacked emails, these accidental, serendipitously created emails were thrown into the mix. And then legions of I won't call them lunatics and hired guns, but guys like that, Christopher Monkton types, showed up. Bjorn Lomborg spent the whole. Bjorn Lomborg's the disingenuous environmentalist. I don't know he's a guy who says that climate change is happening, but it would be quite expensive to fix it. So let's send money to poor people in Africa. He gets like $2.5 million a year to run the Copenhagen Consensus Center from the now very right-wing government of Denmark, which during the whole time they've been paying Bjorn Lomborg, have been slashing their foreign aid budget to the point that they are, instead of best in the world on a per capita basis, they're now like number 11. Just totally disingenuous. So there was a full court press on from the denier industry in Copenhagen. And that was not the only reason that it crashed and burned, I don't think, but boy, it was sure a contributing factor. Since then, we've had this horrible glacier story in which it's turned out that somebody gave bad information to the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they and that suggesting that the glaciers on the Tibetan plateau, on the Himalayan plateau, were going to melt by 2035. There was no evidentiary basis for that information. It got into the report. It should have been caught in peer review. It wasn't. It's embarrassing. It's a mistake. But it's one of those moments where the denier industry has said, aha, there's a mistake. Let's throw out all of climate science, which is a bit stupid. But they have used it, and so now we have GlacierGate threatens climate change. No, it doesn't. Climate change is just fine, thank you. We can believe in gravity or not, and it's just a theory. But if you would choose not to believe in it, it doesn't help you fly. We can decide that we can allow the National Post to decide that climate change isn't happening, but God save our children. Or in fact, my children are all kind of the same age as you guys, so look out, because bad things are happening. We don't stop it, bad things are happening. So we have, again, I'll come back to the 3 points. Was this whole conversation accidental? I mean, is there a sincere, unprovoked debate over climate science? I don't think so. Certainly some very serious people have worked very hard to make sure that sincerity and clarity were no part of the argument. Are there, impolite to call them lunatics and hired guns, but are there some very unsavory sorts taking money to say the wrong thing about climate science and being quoted regularly in the National Post and in the Wall Street Journal? And Steve Malloy is a columnist on Fox News. Critically compromised people who should not be presented as experts in any reasonable realm. The media has badly fallen down on this. And has there been an effect? Well, when 57% of America, when you look outside at what's been happening, when we've just passed the hottest decade in history, 9 of the 10 hottest years in history have occurred in the last 10 years. All of the hottest 10 years in history have occurred since 1998. Every year since 1998 has been hotter than any year before 1997. The Arctic is melting at an unprecedented rate, at a rate unprecedented in modern record keeping. The Arctic is melting. There are fires in Australia such that have never been seen before. I mean, you don't, in fact, have to be a climate scientist to think that there's something wrong. But you have to be a particularly weird kind of expert to argue absolutely that there's nothing wrong. So, the message, the take-home is be skeptical and speak up. Because this is wrong. It's wrong all the time. There are PR people who are getting paid good money to write the contradictory letter to the editor every time a climate change story goes in the paper. We have to do that as well. If you see trash in the news, speak up. Call the editor. Write something. Argue with your father-in-law. I know that's painful. Argue with your neighbors. It's objectionable to have to do it, but I think the world's worth saving. So I would invite you to help, and I'll quit so we have a few minutes for questions. Don't you just love my polar bear? Al Gore I did the Al Gore training in Montreal a couple of years ago, and Al Gore so I got access to the whole Al Gore slide set, and he has all these fabulous pictures of terrible things. But his animals in distress pictures are just my favorite. And of all the animals in distress, this is the only one that both gives you a sense that bad things are happening, but you can still have a smile. So this is my buddy, the polar bear. Are there any questions?
Do you have anything more substantial to share with us beyond arguing with our in-laws about this or responding to Twitter? I mean, I believe what you say is true, but it's got to be a far more important course for us to take than just sit and let the wrong-wingers have the microphone.
I wish I had something more substantial. I mean, what we need is a degree of activism that I haven't seen since the '60s. We need to inspire that kind of outrage and activism. I frankly think that if I think two things. First of all, I'm a capitalist, so I think if we don't find a way to make money saving the world isn't going to get saved. But I also think that if people who are under 30, they were famously trustworthy in the old days. If people who are under 30 don't really get this issue between their teeth and start really fighting about it, that we're lost. So I'm sort of stumping around, and I think that trying to inspire that sort of civic mindedness and activism in a new generation is essential. But boy, I wish I had a lot more to say. Yeah, go ahead.
How would you best propose that the younger generation and all of us, anyone who cares about the planet, fights a public relations campaign that's funded on a lot of money when we are really, really busy people? I mean, I don't know if you know about the Gormley radio show.
No.
It's a very right-wing radio show that's in Saskatchewan, out of Saskatoon. And John Coleman, do you know John Coleman? He was on the Gormley show the other day, and I spent an hour on the Gormley show this morning standing up for this, arguing, debating
nice one.
for the listeners. So I have a political interest that comes with that. So I'm the leader of the Green Party of Saskatchewan. But it's finally, I think we've reached the environmentalists. A lot of us have thought, like, who could buy into this? We don't need to argue it because the science is proven. And a lot of us are all of a sudden realizing this propaganda campaign is getting really strong. And now we're all waking up and saying, okay, we have to get out there. Because it takes away our time from doing other things for the environment to have to fight these guys.
But this is not what we're dealing with here. It's not a science problem. It's not a technical problem, because technically we know what's happening. I mean, it's climate change. The science is quite clear. The solutions are off the shelf. I mean, the things that we need to do: save energy, save money by saving energy. Look for alternative sources of energy and which are already available, wind and solar. There is stuff that redesign your cities, spend the money you're currently spending on stupidly big cars on public transit instead. The solutions are there. What's not there is it's not a technical problem. It's a public policy problem. So getting political is a great answer. Not letting the Gormley show, and this is not where I go because I want to get on the Gormley show and argue on talk radio with people. That becomes a very weird world. But at the same time, to some degree, not letting those conversations go unchallenged is really praiseworthy. And I have this romantic view of Saskatchewan. I was born here. So, and my parents are all from here, and it was from Regina. And I was born in Saskatoon. I'm sorry about that. But the whole of the co-op movement, which gave Canada, I think, some quite good policies. Socialized medicine evolved here, and this was a place where it was full of farmers, and you would think they would get the climate change thing right away. So there has to be an opportunity, I think, to enliven a conversation on this topic in this community. But it has not just been on climate change that the right has dominated the social conversation, the public conversation. It's been on a host of other issues. I mean, the whole idea that taxes are toxic runs completely contrary to the frame that civil society is based on being civil to one another. and to looking after to him with the greatest need from him with the greatest ability. I mean, there were some good frames that came out of Saskatchewan in the 40s and 50s, and came out of Lyndon Johnson's mouth in the 60s that we could go back to. So we don't just, if you get me all political, we don't need to just fight climate change. We need to sort of seize back much of that public conversation. And I think that we have to do a goodly part of it online, because mainstream media is imploding and is intellectually at least corrupt. So yeah, the online social media outlets seem to be the place to look, and in young audiences seems to be the most promising audience. But again, if I could pull the trigger on a campaign tomorrow that I knew would work, I would have done it yesterday.
David Suzuki, and they're doing the cause of water really good. David Suzuki's he's a scientist in fruit fly genetics, is his main area of research. And then Al Gore, well, we know where he is. And it does more harm than good having these people as your ringleaders of the cause, rather than picking real scientists. It would be better than distance ourselves from Suzuki and Al Gore. We do the cause much better. Yeah. And computer modeling is another term very little understood. I looked up these general climate circulation models. You're trying to solve, what they call partial differential equations by finite element, finite different methods and techniques. There's a lot of assumptions. The ocean is like a billiard table smooth. So this is how we got to make it choppy. Well, arbitrarily picked 200 feet is the interface between the ocean and the atmosphere. Then we modified it with taking cloud cover. And then the thing is still very inaccurate, and you can say anything with computer models. Computer model says this, computer model says that. Yeah. It may be better to get away from computer models and get back to maybe the collecting of accurate statistical data or something like that.
Nobody has stopped collecting accurate statistical data. The collection of statistical data is more accurate and more extensive than ever in history. The whole modeling thing drives me a bit crazy, because people don't mind running the economy on models. And God, economic models, I took a little bit of economics, and it was one of those great things about, and education's always like this. When you learn a little bit, you think, wow, I can solve everything with this. And then you learn a bit more and think, uh-oh, this is not actually perfect. And yet we do run the economy on economic models. We make prognostications on which rest the fate of the whole world economy on the basis of economic models. And they are, if anything, way more frail than the supercomputer beauties that people like Andrew Weaver are running out of the University of Victoria. So are the models perfect? No. Are they inevitably incapable of assessing every complication? No. It's a problem. But would you sacrifice the best computing potential, the most advanced computing potential in history in the course of trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future? I think that would be a bad idea. As to Al Gore, Al Gore on one hand has been the greatest thing that ever happened and the worst. There was a point a couple of years ago. I won't even get into that because I got to go. But Al Gore has been a great friend in terms of publicizing the concern about climate science, and he's been a bit of a liability, I admit. David Suzuki is kind of an interesting one. When Harris Decima did a top-of-mind poll that was reported prominently in the Reader's Digest last year about who was the most trusted person in Canada, and David Suzuki outpolled the Queen and Rick Hillier together. I mean, combined, the Queen and Rick Hillier. David Suzuki got more. So there is a credible guy, and the problem with climate scientists is that they tend to spend pretty much all of their time doing climate science, whereas the guys who I'm talking about spend all their time doing PR. So if we don't have some good communicators doing PR, then we don't have anything. because the climate scientists are number one, not going to stop doing climate science, and number two, they're lousy at public relations. And when they get caught in public relations, as they did with the East Anglia emails, it's a big embarrassment. So, it's all difficult one way or the other. I'd love to take questions forever, but I got 15 minutes to be at the CBC, so I'm going to have to run.
Just on behalf of journalism and computer science, I think it's really great that Richard here, and also thanks to Daryl. It was something that Daryl read in the press that got him thinking, yeah, we should really get Richard on campus, which is great, and for journalism, because we want us to be critical thinkers and not to let around with some journalists. So thank you very much, Richard.
Yes. Thank you very much.